You're tuned into the Spot Up Pod, the official podcast of the Spot Up Shot newsletter. I'm your host, Paul Garcia. In today's episode, a rough stretch for the Spurs in the last 4 games. Some news and notes on Stephon Castle, Wemby, and Jeremy Sochan. The Spurs through the midway point of the season, then a question I've been pondering. How should the Spurs approach the upcoming trade deadline? Finally, previewing the Spurs' 2 games against the Pacers this week in France. All this and more on the latest episode of the Spot Up Pod. All right, so like I mentioned, this hasn't been a great stretch for the San Antonio Spurs this past week in their last 4 games, so let's jump right into these 4 games. It did start off on a positive note for the Spurs. They actually got a win, their only win of the week. So let's go back to Monday, January 13th. The Spurs are on the road at LA to play the Lakers. The Lakers were favored by 4.5. This was a close game for the first 3 quarters, but then the Spurs really kicked off the fourth really well defensively, where they started the game off, the fourth quarter off with a 24-9 run, and they ended up winning this game in a blowout against the Lakers. They played some really good defense, especially in the fourth quarter. They held the Lakers overall to 102 points and just 13 points in the fourth quarter, and they got a lot of help from the starters. All 5 starters for the Spurs scored in double figures in this game. Wemby scored 23 points. Devin Vassell scored 23 points. Stephon Castle added 23 points, matching his career high at the time. He also scored a new career high 18 paint points in the game. Harrison Barnes scored 17 points, and then Chris Paul also scored 13 points. Basically, when you put all 5 starters' points together, they ended up scoring 99 points, the starters for the Spurs, and the Lakers as a team had just 102 points on the game. So again, a really big night for the starters, and the Spurs as a defense. Then on Wednesday, the Spurs return home to San Antonio. They're hosting the Memphis Grizzlies for the first time this season. The Grizzlies were favored by 2.5 points in this game, and it was close to start. Then the Spurs ended the second quarter pretty well, where they went into halftime leading by 12 points. Then the defense fell apart in the second half. The Grizzlies scored 43 in the third quarter and 35 in the fourth quarter. The game barely dipped into crunch time, but Memphis took a quick command of crunch time. They ended up pushing their lead as high as 16 points, and they ended up winning this game by 14 points. Stephon Castle scored a new career high 26 points for the Spurs, but the Grizzlies, went to a new strategy of having Zach Edey guard him early on. Then when Edey went off the bench, they had players like Brandon Clark guarding Castle, basically backing off Castle to basically provide a second help defender near the rim, and also to help on Victor Wembanyama with Jaren Jackson Jr. guarding Wemby for most of the game. And so that was one thing that was notable, was the Grizzlies' defensive game plan on Castle. Devin Vassell added 21 points. Victor ended up with 8 blocks in the first half, but just 13 points overall because of, like what I mentioned, how the Grizzlies had 2 defenders near him most of the time. Plus, he was being guarded as well by Jaren Jackson Jr., who's likely going to be the runner-up for Defensive Player of the Year if Wemby ends up winning the award. Then on Friday, the Spurs are still at home. They're hosting the Memphis Grizzlies again. The Spurs now are favored by 1.5 in this game because Ja Morant ended up having to sit out this game due to an injury. So there was no Ja in this game, so the Spurs were the favorites. Again, it was close throughout in the first half. Then with 3:35 left in the third quarter, the game takes a complete turn. The Grizzlies end the quarter on a 16-0 run, and Coach Johnson couldn't call timeouts because he had already ran out of timeouts. He said it within that quarter. So the Spurs, the Memphis run just kept going and going, and again it was 16-0. Then in the final quarter, the Memphis basically took control. They led by as many as 31 points in this game. This is the largest deficit the Spurs have faced this season, and the Spurs end up losing this game to Memphis by 28 points, which is their biggest loss of the season. Again, the defense struggled again there in the second half. Stephon Castle ends up with 20 points in the night. Devin Vassell chips in 21 points. Victor finishes with 19 points, but the Grizzlies used still a similar approach of having 2 bigs on the floor at the same time. So what they did here was that they did start off with Edey, but then Edey got hurt. So then the second half they had Santi Aldama start the second half, and Aldama was guarding Wemby, and then Jaren Jackson Jr. switched on to Castle. That allowed Jackson Jr. to kind of roam the paint again, provide some help against Victor. He's a better player as far as like staying with Castle a little bit more than Edey was. So Castle really couldn't take advantage once the Grizzlies made that switch. And so the Spurs' offense did have difficulty. They missed a lot of shots. And of course, on the other end, the Grizzlies, ran them off the floor in the second half there. And so, the Grizzlies end up getting that win on Friday. Then on Sunday, the Spurs are on the road. They're at Miami against the Heat in their first game against the Heat this season. The Heat were favored by 3.5. It was close again in the first half, but then the Heat took control in the third quarter. They ended up scoring 46 points in the third quarter. The Spurs, it ended up basically turning into a blowout. The Spurs did get it down to 14 points for a possession in the fourth, but Miami quickly responded. They ended up winning by 21 points. The Heat did. Again, the Heat went to a similar strategy of what the Grizzlies did. In the first half, they had Haywood Highsmith starting alongside Bam Adebayo there at the 4-5. But then in the second half, they went to putting Kel'el Ware as a starter, and so Ware was basically guarding Wemby in the second half, and then that allowed Bam to switch on to Castle, which meant that Bam could start roaming the paint and kind of patrolling deterring attempts at the rim. The Spurs, of course, struggled on offense, and then that led to a lot of missed shots, which meant that the Grizzlies got to get the ball, run in transition, and so the Spurs' defense again had a tough time there, with allowing 46 points there in the third quarter. Like I said, the struggling offense fueled defensive issues. Devin Vassell leads the Spurs with 23 points in this game for the fourth game in a row. So I do want to give Vassell some credit, because I know that last week I had talked about how he had been struggling from basically Christmas all the way to that point that I recorded last week's episode on a Monday or on a Sunday. And now Vassell's answered back with 4 straight 20-point games. So this is good for the Spurs to see that Vassell's starting to get, finding his shooting rhythm from outside. Like I mentioned, he had been struggling with this 3 ball, but then 2, he's remaining aggressive about, really driving inside, dunking on players, trying to get to the foul line. So Vassell's at least gotten his game going the right way, but now all of his teammates are kind of struggling here at a bad time here is what's happening right now. Wemby ends up with 21 points, 10 rebounds, and 1 block. Like I mentioned, a lot of that was he started off strong, scoring 11 points in the opening quarter. So he had really gotten going there. But then when the Heat went to that mismatch or that adjustment in the second half, he did struggle a little bit in the second and third quarter. And then in the fourth quarter, he actually, he scored 7 points in that quarter, but a lot of it too was when the Spurs were already down 20 plus. So the game was pretty far out of reach. So overall, Vegas did say the Spurs should have gone 1-3. They went 1-3, but it feels much worse, I think, just because of how they lost some of these games. They got blown out against Memphis. They got blown out against the Heat. And then, those games in the second half just really turned over, and they really struggled there. And so now they are facing another 3-game losing streak. So again, that's been their season long. It has been 3 games losing streak. I think this is the 3rd time now. And so we'll see how they answer back on Thursday in France against the Pacers, as I'm going to talk about a little bit later. All right, diving into some news and notes. On Monday morning, Chris Haynes, who used to work for TNT, he reported that Stephon Castle will be participating in the slam dunk contest at All-Star Saturday night. So that's going to be really fun to see. Steph Castle, participating in the dunk contest. Obviously, if you've been watching the Spurs games, Castle has some major throwdowns this season, whether one-hand, two-handed catching alley-oops. So that's going to be really cool to see what kind of creativity Castle has in that dunk style format, and seeing how he does there. So again, Steph Castle will be part of All-Star Saturday night as part of the dunk contest. The latest round of fan votes came in for the All-Star starters, and specifically focusing on the front court for Wemby. He was still 4th in fan votes, but he was getting closer to catching Kevin Durant, who's kind of in 3rd right now, who was in 3rd on the last round. And so I think that these starters are going to get announced later this week. So again, we'll kind of see if Wemby ends up getting into the top 3 again. He has to finish in the top 3 of fan voting, because they hold the fans hold a huge percentage of the vote. They hold 50% of the vote. The media holds 25%, and then the players hold the other 25%. So again, if he wins the fan vote, gets in the top 3, that helps him get into that starting role. So again, we'll find out later this week if Wemby's going to be an All-Star starter. And if he doesn't, then I think the coaches are going to for sure pick him as a reserve, as I've talked about here on the Spot Up Pod, and as I have written over on the spotupshot.com. So again, we'll kind of see where Wemby finishes in terms of what place he's going to be on the All-Star team. Is he going to be a starter or a reserve? Regarding Jeremy Sochan, the Spurs are going to be expecting him back soon, according to Coach Mitch Johnson. Before the Friday game against the Grizzlies, Coach Johnson had said that Sochan should be coming back in a game or 2. He hasn't. He just mentioned that he's been doing some on-court work as well, that the Spurs have been, he's been doing some on-court work. One interesting thing that I wanted to note, and I've written about this, is that the Spurs have been changing the injury name a little bit, the type, I guess you would say, type of injury. So initially, when Sochan went out in early January, it was due to bilateral lower back injury. I think they called it tightness at the time. Then it changed after a few games to bilateral lower back spasms. And now on this latest injury for the game against Miami that Sochan had to miss, they called it bilateral lumbar spine bone bruise. So again, it's just want to note that the name of the injury has been changing on their injury reports. But again, Coach Johnson was more optimistic that Sochan should be returning soon. So maybe we'll see him on Thursday in France or on Saturday in France before before the Spurs come back home to America. And then now, just regarding the trade deadline, it is now 2.5 weeks away that you're listening to this on a Tuesday. Actually, yeah, it's about 2.5 weeks away. There's still been no, reputable noise about the Spurs. I haven't really seen their name in any kind of rumors that they're interested in this kind of player in the last week. So again, it's been really quiet on their end in terms of outlets that are, usually have good reputations for reporting accurate information in their reporting. Let's keep going. All right, so let's look at the Spurs midway through the season. So the Spurs have completed 41 games. I'm going to go through different sections here. I'm going to start off with their record and standings and where they're at in the standings, then looking at their overall offense and defense, kind of where the numbers are at, where they're ranking right now compared to last season. And then finally looking at the math game and then how they've been doing by month. And it's been a bit of a concerning month here in January. So let's begin with the record and the standings. And I do want to note that I prepped this episode on Monday afternoon. So this information might have changed because there was a bunch of games on MLK Day for the NBA. So through 41 games, the Spurs are 19-22. So they are 3 games below 500 for the first time. Again, the worst they've ever been this season has been 2 games below 500. They did that twice, but now they fall into 3 games below 500 for the first time this season. They were currently 12th out west as of Monday. And again, that wasn't going to change. They were too far to catch the Suns, who were in 11th. They were 1.5 games behind the Suns, who were 21-21, 11th out west, and then 2 games behind the Minnesota Timberwolves, who are 22-21, 10th out west to be in the play-in picture. Per Positive Residual, the Spurs do have the 7th toughest schedule left in the league, but they also have some other teams that they're competing with for a playoff spot also have tough schedules out west, such as the Phoenix Suns have a tough schedule, the Sacramento Kings, the Memphis Grizzlies, and the Los Angeles Lakers. They all have tougher schedules than the Spurs, according to Positive Residual. So at least the Spurs aren't the only team with a tough schedule out west. There's a few other teams out there with them. According to Coach Johnson, one of his remarks that he made was he kind of just talked about how the Spurs are struggling right now. Obviously, they're having a rough stretch of basketball. And one thing he pointed out was that they have been playing better teams lately, and those good teams that they've played have exposed some things for them that they're going to have to work on. So again, that's something that Coach Johnson did mention. One thing that they are going through a rough stretch right now, where they are 1-6 in their last 7 games. But the more concerning part is that the Spurs, they've lost games obviously this year, but they've always been competitive and kind of fought back in games. And maybe they may not make the full comeback, but they're capable of getting it more competitive. What's more concerning is that in 3 of their last 5 games, they've completely gotten blown out. What I mean by that is that they have trailed by 25 or more points in 3 of their last 5 games. And overall for the season, they've only been down by 25 6 times. So again, that's concerning that out of those 6 times in the entire season, 3 of them have happened now in the last 5 games. So they're really just, when teams get control in these games, they're really just taking off away from the Spurs, and San Antonio is having a lot of difficulty right now. And so regarding Coach Johnson's comments about how the good teams are starting to expose some things for the Spurs on the other end, I do want to say that the Spurs are definitely struggling on offense right now. Like I mentioned, in the beginning of this episode, that teams are starting to go to strategy of backing off some of their non-shooters and using 2 bigs on Wemby. So like a team like Memphis either had Jaren Jackson Jr. guarding Wemby or Santi Aldama, and then they'd have a second big. They're kind of roaming the paint, being ready to provide some support. And then the Miami Heat did a similar game plan in the second half with Kelly Ware guarding Wemby, and then Jaren Jackson Jr. being that roam, that defender roaming the paint. And so I think that what Coach Johnson mentioned in some of his remarks were that when the Spurs struggle on offense, that leads to a lot of missed shots, some turnovers, and then that means that their transition defense is now getting tested, where those teams, when the Spurs miss a shot, the teams are getting the rebound, they're pushing the pace, they're getting down court, and then the Spurs are having major communication issues, is what both Coach Johnson and Stephon Castle have said, that they're just not communicating well in those transition opportunities, and so players are getting open looks under the rim, they're kicking out for wide open threes, and so I think that's a big part of why they've been struggling in these games lately, is that they're struggling offense is leading to issues on the defensive end. So they're going to have to really, they can't, it's hard to get, reliable shooters right now, especially, midway through the season. If the players just aren't, if they have like a bunch of players who just don't make accurate shots from 3, then teams are going to continue to leave those players open, which means that they really got to focus on that transition defense and just know that, a lot of times they're going to have to get back, find their man, whoever's out there, out on the other end in transition. But also more concerning too, is that, as Coach Johnson mentioned, there are possessions too where the Spurs do get a layup make or made 3, but then the other team gets the ball and they just completely take off down court. and get a layup inside or get an open three, because the Spurs even are having difficulty in their transition defense getting back even on some of their makes. So again, it's really about the defense right now regarding their transition defense, but then also I think that the offense struggling does lead to that, and it's been interesting to see how some of the teams have adjusted to guarding Victor with putting two different bigs, one big in the paint and then having one big guarding Wemby out there, whether he's on the perimeter or inside. So again, that's just been now update on their record and standings. So now let's go through the Spurs' offense and defense so far through 41 games this season. Kind of what I want to focus on here is look at what are their strengths on offense and defense through 41 games. What are their weaknesses? So when I say strengths, I'm talking about top 10 in these areas, weaknesses, bottom 10, and then just kind of like what's an overall grade or just like an assessment of who the Spurs are so far through midway through the season. So offensively, their strengths, they are top 10 in these different areas. Not a lot of areas here. Assist percentage, so they do a great job of getting an assist every time they move. They have to make a shot. They're usually passing it into a shot that's going to get made. 3-point attempts, they're still a very high volume shooting team from three. They're the sixth. They take the sixth most threes in a game, 43s per game this season. And then also dunk layup range makes. So making those baskets at the closest area to the rim, they are currently 8th there. So again, at least scoring near the rim has been a good positive for them in terms of that closest area to the rim. They are currently 8th there. However, there are some weaknesses, like I mentioned. They're bottom 10 in these three areas that aren't too concerning. So the three areas where they're bottom 10 are floater makes, floater accuracy, and mid-range accuracy. And those aren't efficient shots. You don't really you don't want those too much part of your shot diet. So it's kind of okay that they're not a top 10 team there, or even a league average team. 3-point accuracy. This is a big one, though. Like I mentioned earlier, how teams have figured out the Spurs. They know who's a reliable, dangerous, high volume outside shooter. And there's really three players on this roster. It's Julian Champagnie, and basically Devin Vassell. And obviously Harrison Barnes by accuracy is the most dangerous shooter on the team. He's the highest, accurate shooter from three, but he's not a high volume shooter. So Barnes doesn't take a lot of threes, whereas Champagnie will, and so will Vassell. Now Wemby's also a high volume shooter as well. Obviously we have to say that, but he's usually the guy who's getting the double teams, who has the ball in his hands. So he's having to find the players who are open. So again, since he has the ball in his hands most of the time, we're not going to consider Wemby part of that strategy, where he's actually the guy drawing the double teams. So again, who does he have to kick out to? There's really just two players that the defense is, not going to back off of as much, and that's Champagnie and Vassell. So that means everyone else out on the floor, they're the defense is willing to gamble a little bit and have some of their players back off those players to focus on Victor. So obviously that's a huge issue for this team. And as far as is it a controllable problem right now? I don't think so. I think this is more an issue they're going to have to address in the offseason, where, a big chunk of the roster, if we look at their catch and shoot three percentage, or even some of their wide open three percentage, a big chunk of the roster, most of these players don't shoot efficiently. And so teams are going to be willing to gamble and shrink the inside of the floor while allowing some 3-point attempts. Same thing for their wide open 3-point accuracy. They are also bottom 10 here. They're currently 24th, shooting 37% on wide open threes. So again, that incentivizes the defense to take that gamble, to basically back off players and let them shoot wide open threes if they're going to miss for the majority of the team. So again, those are some of their issues on offense, and then some of their strengths on offense as well. So how would I say an overall assessment grade for the Spurs so far through the 41 games? I would say they're slightly better than bottom 10 offensively. Again, not a great offense, not a top 10 offense, not even really a league average offense, kind of just barely better than being in the bottom 10. So obviously there's still some concerns there for them offensively, specifically the shooting from outside, which shrinks the inside of the floor for San Antonio. Regarding their defense, the Spurs have some areas of where they're top 10. So they're top 10 in opponent effective field goal percentage. So when you combine the two with the three, the Spurs are top 10 there. So they're doing a pretty good job there. Obviously, if you have Wemby, he's going to help you in that department. They're also doing a great job still through the season, midway through the season, of not putting their opponents on the free throw line. So they have the number one defense in opponent free throw attempt rate. They are first in blocks. Obviously, Wemby is collecting most of those. So you have Wemby on your team, you're going to be one of the best blocking teams in the NBA, and that's what they are. They're also top 10 in defensive rebounds per game, but I would say that one's a little bit questionable because they do struggle with allowing opponent second chance points and allowing opponent offensive rebound percentages I'm going to talk about here. So again, that one's a little bit more questionable as far as maybe they're just collecting more of the defensive rebounds is how we could say, just the volume of those rebounds, 34.4 per game. But I still think that's a huge issue for them because the other data is going to say that as we talk about in a little bit. They're also Top 10, actually number one. I give again, we give Victor credit here. So that they are the best team in defending the restricted area, that dunk layup range, where teams are only making 62% of their shots there at that closest point to the rim, and obviously that's a huge factor for having Victor on your team. So obviously he's having a huge impact there in terms of the teams converting those attempts there at the rim. 62% of them are only going in, which is number one for the Spurs amongst all NBA teams. Their weaknesses, though, where they're bottom 10, they are so one thing where they're bottom 10, I'm gonna tie these three areas together because it's part philosophy, but then also just part of the players that are out on the floor. So they're bottom 10 in opponent turnover percentage, meaning that they don't make the opponents turn the ball over a lot. They're bottom 10 in steals, and then that means that if they're not getting turnovers from the opponent, that means it's harder for them to get out on the break and get points off turnovers. And so they are also bottom 10 in points off turnovers. Now, I do want to say that part of this is part philosophy, meaning that the Spurs are usually especially when Coach Pop's there, they're usually a defense who do not like to gamble a lot, out on the defensive possessions. You basically stay with your man. You don't let your man get by you. You don't want to be gambling and putting your help defense in situations or players having to rotate and cover for you just because you're trying to gamble for steals or deflections. So that's partly that's their team philosophy. They're not a high gambling team in terms of trying to get steals or force deflections. Although it is more incentivized now because they have a great rim protector there, and Wemby can cover a lot of mistakes. But right now, I think their priority is just trying to stay in front of the player who has the ball in front of them, not really going for those steals or for those deflections. But also, I would also say that they just have a lot of players on the roster that just aren't known for lockdown perimeter defense, aside from like maybe Jeremy Sochan, Julian Champagnie, Stephon Castle. That's maybe like three players who are known for being really solid, good lockdown defenders. So that's also part of it, is that you can't have all those players out on the floor at the same time, because a lot of them have difficulties on offense, specifically like Castle or Sochan. You can't have them both in the same lineup. It makes it tough on your offense, but then you need their perimeter defense. And then same thing for Champagnie. If he's not getting minutes, it's going to be Vassell. Vassell's a great shooter. Can do a lot more, with the ball in his hands driving in, but also, not at the level of defense that Julian Champagnie brings to your team. So again, it's also part of the roster of how the roster's put together, as far as some of those numbers as well, in terms of creating steals or getting deflections. Opponent of offensive rebound percentage, they are also bottom 10 here. And also, what else? Opponent second chance points, as I mentioned, they are also bottom 10 there. And they're also bottom 10 in opponent dunk layup range makes. So again, I talked about how good the Spurs are in contesting those areas, those attempts, but teams are still scoring a lot there near the rim on them. And part of that is that when Victor sits, their defense really struggles. They haven't really found an answer for a backup big. Sometimes it's Charles Bassey, sometimes it's Zach Collins. They just really haven't found that answer. And that's also a question of, as I'm going to get to a little bit later, do you semi want to address that with like a big who can help you on the board? So there's someone like maybe Jonas Valanciunas, but then, Valanciunas isn't going to help you with that rim protection of deterring teams from attacking the Spurs inside. So again, that's like where, even a trade might not be out there. You just got to, you got to really look at the roster and going into the offseason for this question. And so, yeah, I think that's a lot of the areas. Opponent points in the paint, like I mentioned, is pretty high. And then opponent mid-range accuracy is also pretty high, but that's okay. You kind of want to if you have to give up one shot, you'd rather give up mid-rangers over anything. So again, maybe when Sochan comes back, he can help a little bit there in terms of teams making shots in that dunk layup range. But overall, it is still going to be a question for the roster construction going forward about, what do you do as a Spurs in those moments when Wemby has to sit, basically, because that's where their big issues are. So if I had to say, an overall assessment grade for them right now through their defense through 41 games midway through the season, I'd say that they're slightly worse than league average. So again, not bottom 10 like last year, but at least, right within league average, kind of just a little bit off league average. And when Wemby's on the floor, they are elite defensively. Here are some of the numbers according to Cleaning the Glass. When Wemby's on the floor, opponents are scoring 11.3 points per 100, less points per 100 when he's out there on the floor. That's the 98th percentile according to Cleaning the Glass elite defense. So again, when Victor's on the floor, they're a great defense. But it's the issue, like I mentioned, is what do you do when he has to go to the bench? I mean, he has to rest at some point, and just being in his second year in his career, the Spurs aren't playing him like 40 minutes a night. He's only averaging 33 minutes per game. That means that there's a 15-minute time span every game where he's not on the floor, and that's where the Spurs are really struggling. You can just see it by the eye test. Teams get more motivated, and they start driving inside against the Spurs' backline defenders and whoever else is out there. And so, and the numbers also show it that when Bassey is the 5 or Collins is the 5, the defense really takes a huge hit. And so again, that's kind of one of the questions of, I don't know if there's a perfect trade out there in terms of the candidates that are out there that can address this issue of both the boards plus the rim protection, or maybe you just look at the draft, you look at maybe another trade later in the offseason for a player who does a little bit more of that, is the question. So that's their a quick overall assessment of their defense so far through the midway point of the season. Now let's look at the math game through the 41 game mark of the season. So in terms of overall, the Spurs are getting outscored in total points by they're a minus 58, so they're getting outscored by 58 points total and through all their 41 games. Their big issue still is the 2-point range, where they're getting outscored by 186 points. They still have a pretty big lead in terms of free throw scoring, so they're outscoring their opponents by 119 made free throws. But opponents have really closed the gap in that 3-point shooting. So initially, the Spurs had a pretty good lead in terms of their opponents on made threes. But now they're just a +9 in terms of made threes. So basically, they've only made 3 more threes than their opponent in the overall data. Here is what we see here. So basically, if the trend keeps going how it is, teams are going to the opponent's going to start winning the 3-point line now as well. They're about to take that, whether that's Thursday against the Pacers or maybe Saturday. Basically, if the Spurs get the opponents start making more threes like they've been doing against the Spurs are going to lose that range. And so basically, San Antonio is only going to be winning the free throw line this season. So again, that's just kind of a quick look at their math game in terms of where they're at right now. All right, and then the last part of this assessment of just looking at the Spurs to the midway point is that they are having a rough January right now. So if I look, I basically put all the data together for each month of the season in terms of their offensive and defensive rating and their net rating. And so October, November, when you combine those 2 months, they were just a minus 0.1 points per 100. Basically like league average. So again, that showed kind of in their record where they were almost like a 500 team. They were 20th on offense, which kind of matches what they are overall. But their defense was really good. This is the best defense they were playing this season, which was in October, November. They were almost a top 10 defense. They were 11th during that time frame. Then in December, they were pretty similar. Overall they finished the month minus 0.3 points per 100, which was 16th. So good league average, kind of right there around 500. Their offense kind of stayed in the same place, was scoring 112.3 points per 100, ranked 17th. Their defense started to slip a little bit though, and here's where they fall to like around mid to about league average. Their defense it slips to about 112.5 points per 100, but again, not too concerning, staying around that 500 level of a team. Then in January, now luckily the month's not over yet. There's still about 4 or 5 games left this month, but in January it has been rough here. So offensively, they're having their worst month scoring the ball. They're only scoring 110.7 points per 100, which is 24th. And then defensively, they're having also their worst month defensively, scoring 119 points per 100, which is 27th. So overall, in the month of January, they are a minus 8.3 points per 100, which is 27th. And again, part of this too is that they've been getting blown out lately, and so that's obviously going to lead to really bad looking numbers for you if you're getting blown out. And that's something that they hadn't been doing a lot in the first 2 months or first 3 months, was getting blown out. They were always competitive in games even if they lost them. And so again, that's just kind of a look at their picture of January, and let's see kind of how they close out this month, if they can kind of make it whether winning games or at least losing more competitive games rather than just getting blown out like they had been doing here in these last few games. All right, the next question I want to address is this is more so an open-ended question, so I'm not going to talk about any specific players here, but just more so like, how do you, if you're the Spurs, how do you approach the trade deadline? So again, like I mentioned at the start of this episode, the trade deadline is about 2.5 weeks away now, so it's coming pretty quickly. And what do you do if you're the Spurs? You could go the route of do you go after like a role player who's going to add maybe something to your team that you need right now, but also maybe be on a contract for a few more seasons? So a player here, as I've written about, is someone like Cameron Johnson. There's a pretty high price tag to getting Cameron Johnson. According to the latest reporting, the Nets do want 2 first-round picks. So do you want to do that? Give away 2 first-round picks just to get a player who's going to help you, yes, with the outside shooting, is also on a good contract for 2 more seasons. But again, he's for this season specifically, he may not take you get you into the play-in range. Specifically, they're falling a little bit more. So he's gonna help you on the margins basically. Then to help with not the rim protection, but with the rebounding issue, there on the glass for the opponents, do you maybe go after a player like Jonas Valanciunas, a big who's available from the Washington Wizards, again on a pretty good contract. The Wizards probably want like 2 or 3 second-round picks for him, but if you have to include the contract of Zach Collins, now you're looking at having to give probably away a first-round pick. to get Valanciunas. And again, with Valanciunas, he's going to barely help you on the margins in one specific area, but he's not really going to he's not going to help as much in the rim protection area. He's going to help with the rebounding issue for you. And, again, there's no guarantee that adding Valanciunas or Cam Johnson, immediately puts you back into that playing range. It's they're going to help you, but they're not, gonna make you right away a top 8 or top 6 playoff team out west. Then there's, of course, the star player route. And the issue with this route is that there's not really a lot of star players available. Obviously, De'Aaron Fox has been the player, linked to the Spurs about a month ago. But, things have started to get better in Sacramento. They've kind of they got here on they've been playing better basketball. They're back in the playoff picture out west. They've started to turn things around. And like I had mentioned before, the Fox move wouldn't probably happen until probably the summer, in the event that, one, he doesn't make All NBA, and then two, he actually says he wants out of Sacramento. So the Kings finished this season off playing pretty well, and they're a competitive playoff team in the Western Conference. Then maybe things get, maybe Fox eventually signs an extension with the Kings in the summer. So again, I don't think that the Fox deal is going to be on the table from now within these next 2.5 weeks. I think that the Kings right now, it looks like they're going to end up probably keeping him on the team. So again, aside from I don't think if you're the Spurs, you want to add Jimmy Butler or Brandon Ingram. So again, there's not really a star player out there that they can add this season. So again, I'm really interested to see how they approach this deadline. Cause again, I don't know if they just want to finish out the season, let this group kind of play it out. Maybe they don't get into play-in, maybe they do, or try be more aggressive and trying to get them at least to the play-in by maybe swinging a trade for a player like Cam Johnson or maybe a Jonas Valanciunas to try to help them fight a little bit more, or just kind of just let the season play out and they end up wherever they do in the draft lottery. And so regarding this question, what I did was I wanted to look at the Spurs' schedule from now until the lottery. And so they do have from now until the trade deadline, which is February 6th. So they're going to have 7 games before this time period. So here are their games, and they have some very tough teams here. They're going to play the Pacers twice in France, which is more so like a home crowd for the Spurs, because they're in Wemby's home country. They're going to play the Clippers in San Antonio, who the Spurs did beat pretty well last time they faced the Clippers in San Antonio. But that was also, Kawhi Leonard started to slowly come back. The Clippers were also missing a few players in that game, and also they were on the second out of back-to-back. So maybe if it's I haven't looked at, I didn't look at whether or not somebody's on the second out of back-to-back, but that's something to consider. The Milwaukee Bucks, they're going to play in San Antonio, which obviously the Bucks, in that game in Milwaukee, they really took control and beat the Spurs. They're playing the Heat in San Antonio. The Spurs obviously show that they have some difficulty against Miami. They're going to play the Memphis Grizzlies in Memphis, and obviously they're 0-2 already against the Grizzlies in San Antonio. And then they're going to play the Hawks in Atlanta on the road. And obviously we saw that it took overtime for the Spurs to beat the Hawks, and that was in their own building. And now they're going to be in Atlanta's building for this next game. So let's just say in these 7 games, the Spurs go 2-5. Basically on paper, maybe if I had to do Vegas's, projections, I would say they'd probably go 2-5. So let's say they go 2-5. That would put them at 21-27 going into the trade deadline. They'd be 6 games under 500. Let's say that they play better than that. They go 3-4 in these next 7 games. Then they're 22-26 going into the trade deadline. Again, 4 games under 500. Let's say they do really well and they ended up having a winning record during this time frame of 7 games. Let's say they go 4-3. They're still going to be 2 games below 500 at this point, going 4-3 against these 7 teams. They would be 23-25. So again, that's why I get to this question of, how are they approaching the trade deadline? Because to out west right now, the Wolves are currently 1 game above 500, and that's just to keep you 10th in out west. So again, right now it's showing that even being 500 isn't good enough out west, because the Phoenix Suns are currently 500 and they're not even in the play-in picture. So again, I think that's what I'm really interested to see is, how are the Spurs approaching this deadline? And let's just say they end up, in these next 7 games, they go 2-5 or 3-4. So they're about 4 or 6 games below 500. And basically it definitely looks like, they're out of the play-in picture because there's only 34 games left this season. And so, I also wonder too, how do they go forward with some of the veteran players, somebody like Chris Paul, who's going to be an unrestricted free agent next season, someone like Trey Jones. I know they have Harrison Barnes under contract for 2 more years. So again, that's when those questions start to open up as well. Is if they're pretty far out of the playing picture by that point, within 2.5 weeks, do they start looking at pivoting of just letting the young players finish out the season, or maybe looking to move some of the vets or not? So again, those are just some questions to ponder as these next 7 games approach, because I think these are going to be some critical 7 games for the Spurs, because it's going to show kind of their path of what they're going to do, or how far are they going to be from the playing picture, or are they going to be completely out of it? And now it's just kind of finishing out the season, but knowing that you're going to probably just end up getting a lottery pick within like that 7 through like 14, the 13 or 14 range kind of question. All right, so over on the spotupshot.com, if you'd like to visit the Spot Up Shot, I have 3 different features from this past week if you'd like to check them out. The first one was called Revisiting Stephon Castle's Season High Paint Scoring Night versus the Lakers. So basically in this one, what I talked about was how Castle did finish with 18 paint points against the Lakers. And when I put all his numbers together, both as a starter and a bench player, a lot of times he gets in double digits paint scoring on the nights that he's a starter. So obviously that's going to be an issue whenever Jeremy Sochan eventually comes back, because the idea would probably be that Sochan's going to get a starting job back, and then Castle will have to come off the bench, but Castle hasn't been as aggressive, as productive off the bench. And then part of that too is that whenever he has to play off the bench, he is on a minutes restriction where, if he's not playing really well or impactful out in the game, he may not see many minutes out on the floor. Whereas when he's a starter, he's playing in place of someone who's injured. So they basically need him out there at all times. So he can kind of have some mistakes, but then make up for them during the course of a game. So again, that's over on the spotupshot.com. Another piece I wrote this past week was called The Off Day Grizzlies Defense on Wemby and the Spurs Shooting Wide Open Threes. And so for this one, it's more so a film breakdown looking at how Memphis guarded Wemby in that first Memphis game on Wednesday by having Jaren Jackson Jr. guarding Wemby, but then having Zach Edey and Brandon Clark and Aldama kind of backing off Castle to kind of provide some more rim protection or double teaming against Wemby. And then also in that one, I looked at how the Spurs overall as a team, how some good defensive teams, top 15 defensive teams, they intentionally leave the Spurs wide open threes. And when that happens, the Spurs do have a losing record in those games where teams are leaving them open on wide open threes intentionally. So I have the numbers there in that piece. And then the last feature piece I wrote this past week was called The Off Day Grizzlies Fast-Paced Offense versus Spurs and Jeremy Sochan's back injury. So in this piece, again, it's more so a film breakdown. I look at how in that game against Memphis on Friday, the Grizzlies in the second and third quarter, when they scored like over 35 and 40 points, one thing that they did was that they really took quick shots, meaning that I looked at their clips from possessions where they shot within 12 seconds of the shot clock. And they took, over half their shots in those 2 quarters within 12 seconds, which meant that they were very comfortable kind of just finding one of the first shots that they found or just one pass and finding a shot. Also, like I mentioned, the Spurs were struggling on offense, which meant that they were having to play transition defense on the other end. And the Grizzlies got really good looks. And so, again, that's kind of where I looked at, what was Memphis doing there in the second and third quarter to end up winning that game on Friday. And then just regarding Sochan's back injury, like I mentioned earlier, I just looked at how, he's missed by the time the Sunday game ended in Miami, he had only played, I think, in like half the team's games, or like kind of like less than half, and just kind of he's missed a big chunk of the season. Not his fault, obviously. It's been injury reasons. So he had that fractured thumb early in the season. He had to miss almost all of November. Then he ends up having the back injury that's kind of come up here in January, and so Sochan is still on the injured list. And again, we'll see if he eventually makes his return against Indiana in Paris, France. All right, so before I close up this episode, let's look at the Spurs' next 2 games, and those will be against the Indiana Pacers in Wemby's Hope Country of France. They're going to be playing both of these games in Paris. The first one on Thursday, the second one on Saturday. And, the Spurs have lost 3 in a row. Like I mentioned, they're on a 3-game losing streak, but it's a bad time to play the Pacers because they've actually been playing pretty good basketball. The Pacers are currently 5th out East, and they are currently 8-2 in their last 10 games. So if I had to give my prediction, I would say that I'm going to go with the Spurs in this first game. And I'm going to say it's more so like the crowd support, just kind of fueling the Spurs. They're going to obviously be very hyped to see Wemby in his home country and the Spurs. So I'm going to say that in that one, maybe I'm going to give the Spurs a win there. But then on the second one, I'm going to go with the Pacers. I'm going to think that they make some adjustments, figure out how best to attack the Spurs, or figure out defensively what works for them. And so I would say that they're going to go 1-1 in these next 2 games. It wouldn't surprise me though if they go 0-2 because of the circumstances where the Spurs are struggling right now, and they're running into a team who's playing very good basketball. And if this was like in a neutral territory, not really neutral territory, but if this game was just in San Antonio or Indiana, I would obviously be going with the Pacers for both of these games based on how the Spurs have been playing in these last 2 games. So again, we'll kind of see what happens. Maybe they go 1-1, or who knows? Maybe they defy expectations and go 2-0. We'll see. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of Spotted Pod. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a rating on your favorite podcast apps and our YouTube channel. The Spotted Pod is recorded and produced by Paul Garcia. The music for this episode was written by Vincent Garcia and Paul Garcia. Thank you for listening and have a great day.